When we did it, Paul scribbled on it. He said, "You haven't got my name on it."
When people talk about the Beatles' final chapter, most eyes turn to the endless tension between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, or to George Harrison's frustration at being overlooked, or even Ringo Starr's temporary departure during the White Album. Yet within that chaos, one moment stood out as a creative high point, a song that Paul McCartney wrestled with more than almost any other in his career. A song George Martin, the man who produced nearly everything the Beatles ever put on tape, considered not only difficult to create, but also a modern classic. That song was Yesterday. At first glance, it might seem strange. Yesterday is one of the simplest tracks in the entire Beatles catalog. No walls of guitars, no psychedelic studio tricks, no layered harmonies like Sgt. Pepper. Just Paul's voice and an acoustic guitar with a string quartet arranged by George Martin. But simplicity doesn't mean ease. For McCartney, this was the song that nearly broke him. Not because it was technically complicated, but because it carried the weight of expectation, identity, and artistic risk. The story begins in 1964, when Paul McCartney first woke up with the melody in his head. He was living in the attic bedroom of Jane Asher's family house on Wimpole Street in London. The tune arrived fully formed, almost as if it had been handed to him in a dream. But instead of feeling triumph, Paul felt suspicion. He couldn't believe it was original. For months, he asked friends, bandmates, and fellow musicians whether they had heard it before. Nobody had. And yet, even after being reassured, Paul didn't know what to do with it. He carried the melody around for over a year, unable to find the right words. His placeholder lyrics, famously beginning with "scrambled eggs," became a running joke, but underneath the humor was frustration. McCartney was desperate to transform the melody into a real song. What made it worse was that the Beatles' working environment at that time wasn't always kind to such personal material. John Lennon was driving the band deeper into biting, raw rock songs. George Harrison was trying to push more of his own writing into the spotlight. Ringo Starr was focused on keeping up with the breakneck recording schedule. Paul, meanwhile, was obsessed with turning his haunting melody into something timeless. George Martin later explained that the song was so difficult to write not because the chords or arrangement were complex, but because of how vulnerable it was. Most Beatles songs up to that point were built for a band. They thrived on the chemistry of four musicians playing together. Yesterday didn't fit that mold. It was delicate, fragile. It didn't sound like the Beatles at all. And that scared Paul. Would fans accept a Beatles track without John, George, or Ringo? Would Lennon mock him for drifting too far into sentimentality? Would Harrison dismiss it as self-indulgent? For months, Paul tinkered with the lyrics. He cycled through different themes, different ideas, trying to capture the sense of loss and longing that the melody evoked. It was only after a long period of private testing, singing it to friends, adjusting words line by line, that the song finally crystallized. The title, Yesterday, emerged, and with it, a set of lyrics that carried universal weight without being specific. Everyone could relate to it, and yet it was deeply personal for Paul. When Paul brought Yesterday into Abbey Road Studios in June 1965, the tension was immediate. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr had no role in the recording. The band that had taken over the world with electric guitars and relentless touring was suddenly sidelined. Paul sat in the studio with just his acoustic guitar. George Martin proposed adding a string quartet, an idea that made Paul hesitate at first. Rock bands didn't use string quartets. It risked sounding pretentious, or worse, soft. But Martin insisted that the arrangement would highlight the purity of the melody. In the end, Paul agreed, and the result was one of the most strikingly original moments in Beatles history. The session itself was unusually quiet. No arguments, no shouting, no clashing egos. Just Paul, Martin, and the musicians carefully shaping a piece of music that sounded more like a classical ballad than a rock record. Yet behind that calm was a storm brewing. John Lennon wasn't particularly impressed. Harrison seemed uninterested. Ringo didn't even play on the track. For a band built on unity, Yesterday marked a crack in the foundation. It showed that Paul could succeed without the others. For some, it was inspiring. For others, it was threatening. George Martin, however, saw the bigger picture. He understood that Yesterday wasn't just a ballad, it was a statement. A demonstration that the Beatles could transcend genre, that they weren't confined to guitars and drums. He later described the song as one of the most perfect pop compositions ever written. But he also emphasized how difficult it had been for Paul to bring it to life. Not technically, but emotionally. Writing something so stripped down, so direct, required courage. When Yesterday was released on the 1965 album Help, it stood out instantly. Surrounded by upbeat tracks and standard rock numbers, it felt almost alien. Some critics praised it as genius, while others questioned whether it even belonged on a Beatles record. In the United States, Capitol Records seized the opportunity to release it as a single, and it became one of the most successful songs in history. In the UK, however, it never appeared as a single during the band's active years, a reflection of the band's own unease with how it fit their image. For McCartney, the success was bittersweet. On one hand, it proved that his instincts had been right. On the other, it highlighted the growing divide between him and his bandmates. John Lennon reportedly dismissed the song in later years, calling it Paul's track alone, not a Beatles creation. Harrison gave it little attention, rarely mentioning it. Ringo, characteristically, stayed neutral. But Paul couldn't escape the shadow of Yesterday. It became both his greatest achievement and, in some ways, a curse. By the late 1960s, the tensions that Yesterday had foreshadowed became undeniable. Paul was increasingly pushing the band toward his vision, melodic, precise, structured. John was drifting into raw, more experimental territory. George Harrison was fighting for recognition as a songwriter in his own right, and Ringo was often caught in the middle. Looking back, George Martin identified Yesterday as a turning point, the moment when McCartney proved he didn't need the others. A beautiful song, yes, but also a signal that the balance of power within the band was shifting. Over time, Yesterday grew far beyond the Beatles. It became one of the most covered songs in the world, with thousands of artists recording their own versions. For Paul, it became a staple of his solo performances, long after the Beatles ended. Yet even as it defined his career, he often spoke about the difficulty of writing it, the endless second-guessing, the struggle to match words to melody. That vulnerability made the final product all the more powerful. For George Martin, Yesterday was proof of Paul McCartney's genius, not just because of the melody, but because of the perseverance it took to bring it into the world. In Martin's eyes, it was a modern classic, one that showed how simplicity could be more daring than complexity. He understood that the hardest songs to write are often the ones that seem the simplest in the end.